Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is something Hollywood was never meant to let you hear. Imagine the rattle of iron wheels on bone-dry dirt, the suffocating heat of the desert, and a coffin-shaped carriage crammed with bodies. 7 days trapped, no mercy, no escape. You've been told this was adventure, romance, the Wild West spirit. But that was the myth. The truth is darker. Stagecoach travel wasn't a journey. It was a sentence. A slow descent into exhaustion, sickness, violence, and despair. The movies never showed you the stench of unwashed bodies pressed together in unbearable heat. They never showed the dysentery, the lice, the frostbite, or the corpses quietly dragged out at night and left for the vultures. They gave you a myth, because men who endure illusions are easier to control. Do you see it? The fantasy wasn't just about the Old West. It was about you, about how stories are used to shape the way you think about struggle, risk, and power. The Stagecoach was not a romantic frontier ride. It was a system of endurance designed to break the weak and test the will of those desperate enough to climb aboard. And those who survived carried scars, physical and psychological, that no camera would ever capture. Imagine 24 hours without food, without clean water, bouncing endlessly over jagged terrain, each rock slamming into your spine until you forgot where pain ended and your body began. This was the real price of travel. In a world ruled by monopoly and greed, Hollywood hid this reality because they needed you to worship the dream, not the truth. They needed you to consume a sanitized fantasy of the West, where courage looked clean, where hardship was noble, where danger was glorious. But when you strip away the illusions, what you find is something older, something more sinister. Institutions crafting narratives to control the masses. Stagecoaches aren't just wagons of misery. They were metaphors for every system of control that locks men into cages while convincing them they're free. And once you see that, you can never go back. Picture it again. You're inside that stagecoach, 6 strangers pressed against you, the air thick with sweat and disease. The driver lashes the horses mercilessly because time is money, and delay means ruin. But what no one tells you is this. Most passengers didn't make the journey intact. Some lost their minds before they reached the destination. The rattling never stopped. The jolts shattered teeth. Sleep came in fragments, stolen in seconds, before another jolt threw you awake. Your body became a prison. You couldn't escape. And outside, the threat wasn't just bandits or natives, as Hollywood loves to show, but starvation, dehydration, exposure, the sheer indifference of the landscape itself. The West was not generous. It swallowed men whole and returned nothing but bones. This is the part history forgets. Stagecoach companies advertised their services like luxury. Swift passage across the frontier, they promised. But it was a lie. The reality was a system of exploitation, where men were charged gold for the privilege of suffering. Wealth bought the illusion of progress. Poverty bought you death. The rich sat in San Francisco parlors sipping whiskey, while the desperate bled out on a desert trail, coughing up dust and begging for water that never came. And here is the hidden truth. Hollywood's version of the stagecoach wasn't a mistake. It was programming. They gave you heroes on horseback, noble outlaws, and grit polished into romance. Why? Because the suffering had to be erased. If you knew what the frontier really was, you might begin to see what the present really is. A system where pain is hidden, where sacrifice is sold as adventure, and where the ones pulling the strings profit from the illusions you consume. You've been taught to admire the cowboy, to envy the freedom of the open trail. But freedom is the greatest illusion of all. The men in those stagecoaches weren't free. They were trapped in a rolling coffin designed by corporate hands, every mile grinding them down into obedience. Think about that. How different is it from today, when you pay for cages disguised as comfort, distractions packaged as entertainment, and myths carefully crafted to keep you docile? The West was not wild, it was engineered, and the stagecoach was its most brutal instrument. Close your eyes and listen to the rhythm of the wheels. Clatter, slam, groan, clatter. Hour after hour, day after day, the sound drills into your mind until sanity begins to erode. That sound wasn't just noise. It was a weapon. It stripped men down, broke them into fragments, left them hollow enough to be molded by whoever held the reins of power. Inside the stagecoach, men became animals. The cramped quarters forced strangers into each other's sweat, coughs, and disease. Conversations that began as polite turned to arguments, then to threats. Knives flashed in the night. Paranoia grew with each passing mile. Who would snap first? Who would survive the ride? Hollywood paints camaraderie, but the truth was closer to psychological warfare. Food was scarce. Water was rationed. Passengers often went 36 hours without rest, their stomachs gnawing at themselves, their throats cracked and bleeding from thirst. The drivers didn't care. The companies didn't care. The only priority was speed and profit. If a passenger collapsed, they were dragged out and left behind. The coach rolled on, indifferent, unflinching. And in that indifference lies the first real lesson. Systems are never designed to care about you. They are designed to extract from you. The dirt roads were filled with hazards, fallen trees, flash floods, ambushes. But the greatest danger was within. A man's body, deprived of sleep and nourishment, begins to betray him. Hallucinations, fevers, madness. Imagine the horror of staring at your fellow passenger's face and seeing not a man, but a monster. Imagine hearing voices in the endless desert night, whispering secrets you can't understand. That's what stagecoach travel really was. A crucible that revealed the fragility of the human mind. And yet, the public never knew, because the survivors didn't speak. Or if they did, their voices were drowned out by the manufactured myths of dime novels and motion pictures. Those myths erased the suffering and replaced it with spectacle. Gunfights, saloons, love stories under the stars. It was the birth of a pattern that still controls you today. Rewrite the pain, erase the struggle, glorify the suffering until the masses mistake torment for glory. Every bump of those wheels was a reminder that you weren't free. You were trapped inside someone else's design. And isn't that still true now? There is something you must understand. Stagecoach travel was not just misery. It was a ritual. A brutal passage designed to strip men of illusion and force them into confrontation with their own weakness. But when Hollywood erased that truth, they didn't just rewrite history. They rewired your perception of suffering itself. In those days, every mile was agony. The wooden wheels splintered against stone, shattering spines with each jolt. Dust coated lungs until breath came like swallowing knives. And when night fell, the cold was merciless. Blankets were thin, fires impossible on the open road. Men shivered until their teeth cracked. Frostbite ate at their hands. Sleep was a luxury few found, and when they did, it was broken by sudden jolts, by the scream of horses, or by the choking cough of the man beside them. But here's the secret. The stagecoach wasn't just a tool of travel. It was a system of control. It separated the wealthy from the desperate. It punished the poor who could not afford private wagons or safer passage. The companies knew the risks, knew the torment, but marketed it as adventure. And the public, hungry for progress, believed. Doesn't that sound familiar? An institution sells you struggle disguised as opportunity, and you pay for the privilege of being broken by it. The riders endured more than physical torment. They endured humiliation. Men vomited into their own laps because there was nowhere else to turn. Women fainted in the heat, collapsing against strangers who stared ahead in silence. Children dragged along on desperate family journeys, wailed into the endless night until their voices broke, and every mile reinforced the truth. Human dignity was irrelevant in the face of profit. Yet when this history reached the screen, it was polished, rewritten, stripped of all its teeth. The suffering vanished, replaced by heroism. Why? Because if you see the past as it was, you might recognize the present for what it is. You might see that every age has its stagecoach, a brutal system disguised as progress, sold as necessity, endured by the masses, while the elite profit in silence. You were never meant to know this. You were meant to consume the myth, smile at the fantasy, and never ask why. But now you do. And that changes everything. Think of the stagecoach not as transportation, but as a coffin dragged across the frontier. Every passenger inside was sealed into a slow-motion tomb, each jolt another nail hammered into their sanity. This wasn't a journey. It was a dismantling, and the ones who survived didn't emerge stronger. They emerged quieter, obedient, controlled. That is the part Hollywood would never dare to show you. Passengers paid dearly for their seats. But what they purchased wasn't safe passage. It was suffering. Imagine handing over weeks of wages, only to be thrown into a rattling box where you were starved, battered, and left to rot in your own sweat. That transaction is the truth behind the myth. You didn't buy travel. You bought torment, disguised as progress. The same way men today buy subscriptions, comforts, distractions, never realizing the system is extracting from them while offering almost nothing in return. And here's the chilling part. Stagecoach companies engineered this. They cut corners to maximize profit. Horses were driven to collapse. Drivers were beaten into silence. Repairs were neglected until crashes became inevitable. Every death, every broken passenger, every shattered mind was weighed against revenue. And always, profit won. This was not incompetence. It was design. Now ask yourself, why does Hollywood glorify this nightmare? Why turn torment into myth? Because stories are the leash of civilization. If you see suffering as heroic, you will endure it without complaint. If you believe hardship is noble, you will march into cages willingly. If you confuse exploitation with freedom, you will never resist. And so, the real misery of stagecoach travel was buried, replaced with legends of grit and glory that turned slaves into dreamers. This is the hidden machinery of narrative. It doesn't just rewrite history. It rewires men. It takes the truth that you are trapped in security, someone else's system, and replaces it with illusion that you are free, bold, courageous. The illusion is what breaks you, not the hardship itself. Because when you suffer under the banner of a lie, you don't rise, you submit. Every mile of that coffin on wheels was a lesson in control. And the reason you were never meant to know this is simple. Once you see through one illusion, you start to see through them all. The truth is this. Stagecoach travel was not just a brutal ordeal of the body. It was an initiation of the mind. To step into that cramped coffin on wheels was to surrender control, to give yourself over to a system that promised you progress, but offered only punishment. The passengers endured because they believed they had no choice. That belief is the most dangerous weapon in human history. Think of the hunger gnawing at their stomachs, the thirst that split their lips open until blood mixed with dust. Think of the fevered eyes staring out into endless desert, convinced salvation waited just beyond the horizon. That belief that tomorrow might be better was what kept them in their seats. They stayed even when their bodies screamed to break free. They stayed even when their dignity rotted. And so the stagecoach became more than transportation. It became a mirror of how systems rule men. By dangling hope just out of reach, mile after mile, until death itself becomes easier than resistance. Hollywood scrubbed this clean, of course. In their world, the stagecoach was a theater of courage, a backdrop for gunfights and romance. But that's the trick. The rewriting wasn't for accuracy, it was for obedience. Because if men saw the past for what it really was, a raw engine of exploitation, they might begin to question the present. And nothing terrifies the architects of power more than a man who sees the system for what it is. The real frontier wasn't land, it was the human mind. The stagecoach was a prototype for every modern institution that cages you while convincing you to pay for the privilege. Schools, workplaces, media, they all use the same formula. Confine you, exhaust you, starve you of freedom. Then whisper that endurance makes you noble, that your suffering has meaning, that one day it will all pay off. It rarely does. But the illusion keeps you in your seat. Here's the hard truth. Most men never step off the stagecoach. They ride it their whole lives, blind to the fact that they were meant to walk away long ago. But you're not most men. You wouldn't be here if you were. There is a question you must ask yourself. Why were men willing to endure such torment? Why did they climb into that coffin on wheels, knowing the journey would strip them of body and spirit? The answer is older than the West. It is the same answer that binds men now. The hunger for progress, the illusion of destiny, the promise of reward at the end of suffering. But here is the cruel reality. For many, there was no reward. The destination was often worse than the journey. Towns reeked of disease, opportunity was swallowed by monopoly, and the so-called land of freedom was already carved up by powerful hands. Men endured agony for a lie. The stagecoach wasn't just a road to misery. It was a road to disillusionment. Think of the lesson buried here. How often are you promised that the pain you endure today will lead to greatness tomorrow? How often are you told to work longer hours, give more of yourself, sacrifice your health, your time, your sanity, because someday it will all be worth it? That someday rarely comes. Just like those men who stepped off the coach, only to find poverty, disease, or an early grave. The system survives because hope blinds you to the theft happening in real time. The stagecoach companies knew it. They advertised adventure while delivering torment. They glamorized the journey while hiding the corpses. Hollywood later finished the job, polishing the coffin into a carriage of dreams. And men, decade after decade, bought the story. They believed hardship was glory. They believed suffering was noble. They believed the whip at their backs was freedom's hand. Do you see the pattern now? The stagecoach is not dead. It has only changed form. Today it wears suits, speaks through glowing screens, and offers subscriptions instead of tickets. But the mechanics are the same. Pack the masses into cages, drain them with exhaustion, sell them illusions of meaning, and profit from their obedience. And here's the part you were never supposed to hear. Most will never break free. They will ride the rattling coffin to their graves, convinced all along that the journey was noble. Only a few will step off, look back, and see the bars that were always there. Which one will you be? The rattle of the wheels never stopped. Day after day, hour after hour, each jolt was a hammer pounding at the edges of sanity. Men clenched their jaws until teeth cracked. Women prayed under their breath until their voices broke into whispers of madness. Children screamed until silence fell, not because they slept, but because their throats could scream no longer. This wasn't travel. It was torment. And torment has always been the purest tool of control. The companies could have made it better. They could have built sturdier coaches, given rest, allowed dignity. But they didn't. Why? Because suffering was profitable. More speed meant more passengers, more money, more dominance. Every broken body was a casualty weighed against gold, and gold always won. That is the law of power. Your pain is nothing compared to profit. Now ask yourself, why don't you know this story? Why were you raised on myths of heroism and romance instead of the truth of filth and despair? The answer is simple. Because myths make men easier to rule. If you believe the West was noble, you will admire its conquerors. If you believe suffering leads to glory, you will endure cages without rebellion. That's the same story you are told today. Different century, same machine. Hollywood was never just entertainment. It was indoctrination. When they put John Wayne on a stagecoach, riding through danger with a heroic grin, they were not telling you history. They were telling you what to believe about hardship. They were showing you how to interpret your own chains. You were not supposed to see the lice, the vomit, the frostbite. You were supposed to see freedom. And so, millions of men worshipped illusions, while the truth rotted in silence. But you're here now, listening, beginning to see. And once you see, the spell begins to break. Because the stagecoach is not just a relic of history. It is a prophecy. The same cage that rolled across deserts now rolls across your life, disguised in steel, screens, and salaries. The question is not whether it exists. The question is whether you will keep paying for your seat. Remember this. The men who endured the coffin on wheels did not come out stronger. They came out broken, compliant, and silent. The same fate waits for anyone who mistakes slavery for freedom. There's a silence that lives inside suffering. After days in the coffin on wheels, after the hunger and the cold, after the endless rattling that split skulls and spines, men stopped speaking. Words died in their throats. They sat in stillness, rocking with the wheels, broken into silence. That silence was not peace. It was submission, and submission is the signature of control. Understand this. The stagecoach was not an accident of history. It was a design, a moving prison that wore the mask of progress. You bought your ticket believing in destiny, but what you received was degradation. The system didn't just want your money. It wanted your obedience. It wanted to teach you to endure without question, to accept torment as the cost of survival. That is how power works. Break a man's body, starve his dignity, and he will thank you for the privilege of arriving alive. But here's the part you were never supposed to know. This same mechanism operates today. Look around. The coffin on wheels has become your office cubicle, your commute, your debt, your endless screen. The jolts are different, but the effect is the same. Exhaustion, silence, obedience. And while you sit there, drained of strength. The architects of the system profit from your submission. The lie has evolved, but the structure is eternal. Hollywood's role was not innocent. By rewriting the agony of the stagecoach into romance, they did more than distort the past. They trained your mind to reinterpret pain as glory, to see struggle not as exploitation, but as nobility, to embrace chains as badges of honor. The movies were not history. They were programming. And programming is the deepest form of control. Because once you confuse suffering with freedom, you no longer resist. You ride willingly, whispering that it's destiny. While the cage rolls on, the survivors of the stagecoach didn't tell their stories. Or if they did, no one listened. Their silence became the soil from which myths were planted. Myths became legends. Legends became cinema. And cinema became scripture for men too distracted to question the lie. Now you hear the truth. And once you hear, you cannot unhear. The only question left is whether you will remain silent like the broken passengers, or speak against the myth that cages you still. The deeper you look at stagecoach travel, the clearer the pattern becomes. It wasn't just about crossing distance. It was about crossing obedience. Every man who climbed aboard was being conditioned, whether he knew it or not. The endless jolts, the hunger, the stench, the fevers, they weren't just accidents. They were trials. And trials are the foundation of every system of power. Think of ancient initiation rites. Tribes dragging boys into the wilderness, starving them, exhausting them, breaking them down until the old self shattered and the new self emerged, obedient to the tribe. Think of armies marching recruits until their feet bled, stripping them of individuality until all that remained was silence and obedience. The stagecoach was the same ritual in disguise, a test designed not for freedom, but for compliance. A system teaching men to submit to misery in exchange for the illusion of progress. Hollywood could never show this. They needed the coffin on wheels to look like adventure, not indoctrination. Because if men ever recognized the pattern, they would begin to see it everywhere, in classrooms, in workplaces, in governments, in screens. Everywhere that institutions break you down, then sell you a myth to justify your brokenness. The story was never about the West. It was about you. About keeping you on the coach, silent, rocking, obedient. This is why the silence of the passengers matters. The moment when men stopped complaining, stopped resisting, stopped even hoping for comfort. That silence was victory for the system. Because once a man stops speaking, he stops rebelling. Once he stops rebelling, he becomes manageable. That is how empires are built, not on conquest of land, but conquest of spirit. And here's the revelation you weren't supposed to hear. Every empire, every institution, every hidden power structure uses the same formula. Strip you of dignity, cage you in suffering, starve you of truth, then sell you a myth to keep you quiet. The myth becomes your prison, and you thank your captors for building it. Stagecoach travel wasn't just a nightmare of the frontier. It was a rehearsal for the entire architecture of modern control. And once you see that, once you recognize that the coffin on wheels never disappeared, it only changed form, you cannot unsee it. The ride is still happening. The only difference is whether you stay on board or step off. Every stagecoach passenger lived inside a paradox. They paid for freedom, yet bought captivity. They sought progress, yet found decay. They believed in adventure, yet endured torment. That paradox was never resolved. It was buried, rewritten, transformed into myth. And myth is the strongest chain man has ever worn. The survivors rarely told the truth. Why? Because the truth shamed them. To admit that you endured humiliation, sickness, starvation, and silence, not for glory, but for profit, was to admit you were deceived. And deception is unbearable for the ego. So, they stayed quiet. Their silence allowed storytellers, novelists, and later Hollywood producers to hijack their suffering and polish it into legend. The passengers lived hell, but the world inherited a dream. That is how control sustains itself, through silence, shame, and the rewriting of agony into beauty. But here is the deeper current. The silence of those men was not just personal. It was systemic. Because when you accept torment and refuse to speak of it, you feed the cycle. You allow the next generation to climb aboard the same coffin, believing the same lie. That is how institutions replicate, not through strength, but through secrecy. And every man who remains silent becomes a servant of the myth, a link in the chain binding the next. Look at your world now. How many men stay silent as their lives are devoured by debt, by exhaustion, by illusions of freedom? How many endure in quiet, believing their torment has meaning, when in truth it only feeds the machine? That silence is the victory of power. That silence is the continuation of the stagecoach. Hollywood understood this well. Their job was never to tell you what happened. Their job was to give you a script for how to suffer, to teach you to confuse chains for destiny, to make you believe that misery endured in silence is noble. That's why you never saw the rotting corpses by the trail, or the madness in the passengers' eyes. You only saw grit polished into glory, but now you've heard the whispers beneath the myth. You've seen the rot beneath the paint, and once that awareness awakens, the silence breaks. That break is dangerous, because when men begin to speak, the myth unravels. And when the myth unravels, power begins to tremble. This is the moment where you must decide if you are just another passenger or something else. For hours, you've ridden this coffin of words, seeing what the stagecoach truly was. A prison on wheels, a system of suffering disguised as freedom. And here is the truth you were never supposed to face. Most men still live that way today. They pay for their own cages. They call it career. They call it responsibility. They call it the good life. But it is the same coffin, the same jolts, the same silence. The men who rode the stagecoach were broken by design. Their obedience was forged in hunger, their silence carved by exhaustion. They didn't rebel because they believed they had no choice. That is the poison that keeps the system alive, the belief that you have no way out. But listen carefully. You do. You always did. And right now, you feel it. A stirring, a crack in the illusion. That feeling is dangerous, because once it grows, you cannot return to the cage. This is where the transformation begins. The stagecoach is not just history, it is a mirror. And the reflection staring back at you is asking, will you stay silent like the passengers before you, or will you step off? The choice is not abstract. It is here, now, in this moment. I want you to burn this truth into yourself. Write it into your blood. Lock it into your identity, so the system can never steal it again. To do that, you must speak, out loud, visible, undeniable. Go into the comments right now and carve these words twice. I step off the stagecoach. Write it once for the world. Write it again for yourself. That phrase is not just a sentence. It is a rebellion. It is a declaration that you see through the illusion, that you refuse silence, that you reject the coffin disguised as freedom. When you write it twice, something shifts. You stop being a passenger. You become a man who chooses. The others will scroll P. Estan, still trapped in silence. But you, if you speak, will mark yourself as awake. And once awake, you cannot go back to sleep. You've spoken the words. Twice. You've carved them into the open air, where they can't be erased. I step off the stagecoach. Maybe you felt a tremor when you wrote it. Maybe you didn't. But whether you realized it or not, that act was more than a comment. It was a line drawn in the sand. You have broken the silence that swallowed the passengers before you. And once broken, silence cannot rebuild itself. Understand this. Transformation doesn't happen when you consume knowledge. It happens when you act. Every man on the stagecoach had the chance to scream, to fight, to resist, but they didn't. They sat in silence, rocking back and forth, enduring what they were told could not be changed. Their silence chained them. Your words freed you. By speaking, you've declared war on the illusion. And in that declaration, you have already separated yourself from the millions who will ride the coffin until their last breath, never daring to question the ride. This is the difference between them and you. They inherit myths. You inherit truth. They obey the story. You break it. They die passengers. You rise as a man who steps off. That is the power of ritual. It hardens a choice into identity. And identity is destiny. But do not mistake this moment for an ending. This is only the threshold. Because stepping off the stagecoach doesn't mean the world suddenly welcomes you. The systems that profit from your obedience still exist. They will resist you. They will whisper through media, through work, through culture, begging you to sit back down and be silent. The lies will not vanish overnight. They will claw at you, promising safety if you return to the coffin. But you have already marked yourself. You cannot ride again. So let me tell you something dangerous. Once you see the illusion, every cage begins to glow. You'll see it in your job, in your debts, in your distractions, in the store. You're fed to keep you quiet. That vision is your curse and your weapon. Most men are blind passengers. You are not. You are the man who stepped off. Never forget those words. Speak them again when you feel the pull of silence. Whisper them in your mind when the system tempts you to obedience. Because that phrase is now yours, and it will carry you further than any coffin on wheels ever could. Now that you've stepped off the stagecoach, you must see the battlefield for what it truly is. Institutions have always feared one thing above all else: men who see through the illusion. A man who endures quietly is useful. A man who suffers in silence is predictable. But a man who speaks, who refuses the coffin, who calls the myth by its true name, that man cannot be controlled. And that is why the truth of stagecoach travel was buried. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was too dangerous. Think about this. The agony of the coffin on wheels wasn't just forgotten. It was deliberately erased. Writers, storytellers, Hollywood directors, they didn't simply polish history. They weaponized it. They took the cries of broken men, the vomit, the frostbite, the corpses left for vultures, and they transformed it into legends of courage. That wasn't entertainment. That was indoctrination. A campaign to teach generations of men that suffering in silence is noble, that obedience is strength, that exploitation is freedom. Why? Because silent, obedient men build empires. They till the soil, fight the wars, pay the taxes, sit in the cages, and never revolt. They believe their torment is destiny. They even thank their masters for giving them the privilege of enduring it. That is the perfection of control. When the slave calls his chains honorable, the stagecoach was the prototype. Hollywood was the amplifier. And today's institutions are the inheritors. Governments, corporations, schools, media, they all use the same blueprint. Strip away your dignity, force you into silence, rewrite the suffering into a myth that makes you grateful, and then ride you until there is nothing left to extract. But you are awake now. You have seen what others refuse to see, and that awareness is dangerous because it burns illusions to ash. You will notice the cages in your life with new eyes. You will see the myths for what they are, tools of obedience. And once you see them, you will never again sit quietly in the coffin. This is why institutions bury truths, not because they are trivial, but because they are lethal. Knowledge is not neutral. Knowledge is a weapon, and in the wrong hands, it becomes rebellion. You are holding that weapon now. The question is, will you wield it? Look closely, and you'll see the coffin on wheels was never unique. It was only one mask in a theater that stretches across every civilization. The pattern repeats because the pattern works. Strip men of comfort, bind them in hardship, starve them of dignity, and then sell them the illusion that their pain is noble, even holy. Once they believe that lie, they endure without rebellion. And that is the dream of every ruler, every empire, every hidden hand that feeds on obedience. The Romans did it with their legions, march after march until men bled from their feet, beaten into silence by exhaustion. The Egyptians did it with their slaves, promising eternity in exchange for backbreaking labor beneath the desert sun. Medieval kings did it with their peasants, sanctifying starvation as divine destiny. And in the frontier, American companies did it with the stagecoach, breaking bodies with wheels and dust, then selling adventure as the reward. The blueprint never changed, only the costumes did. And what about today? Do you think it's different? No. The coffin is only more sophisticated. You're told to sit in offices under fluorescent light for endless hours, drained by screens, suffocated by debt, medicated into obedience. You're told it's noble. You're told it's progress. You're told it's the price of survival. And just like the passengers of the stagecoach, you endure because you believe you have no choice. That is the poison. That is the lie. Hollywood's myth-making was not an accident. It was continuity. It was the same machine that turned gladiator blood into spectacle. The same machine that painted kings as divinely chosen. The same machine that sanctified starvation in the name of God. Myths are not decorations. They are weapons. They keep the masses quiet, blind, and willing to pay for their own cages. The agony of the stagecoach is only one thread in this web, but by pulling on it, you see the entire structure unravel. You see how your ancestors were shackled. You see how you are shackled, and you see the truth the architects fear most. If enough men recognize the pattern, the cage collapses, because no system can survive once the passengers decide to step off together. You've already stepped off. The question now is, how many will follow you? The stagecoach was primitive in its design, but perfect in its purpose. It broke the body until the mind submitted. But when the frontier ended, the system did not die. It evolved. The new architects realized something. You don't always need to crush the body to enslave a man. If you can control his mind, he will chain himself. And so the age of psychological control began. Hollywood was its cathedral. Every film became scripture, every image a sermon teaching men how to interpret suffering. The Coffin on Wheels was remade into a story of grit, honor, courage. But the lesson beneath it was sinister. Endure torment without question, because hardship is glorious. Think about it. Every Western you've ever seen wasn't just entertainment. It was indoctrination. The gunfights and saloons distracted you, but the core message seeped deeper. Obey the story, accept the suffering, worship the myth. This is why history was sanitized. Because the truth is too dangerous. If men saw the lice, the vomit, the frostbite, the corpses left in the dirt, they would understand that suffering is not always noble. It is often engineered. And if men understood that, they would begin to ask, how much of my own suffering today is designed? How much of what I endure is not fate, but architecture? That question alone could topple systems. So the storytellers went to work. Not just in movies, but in schools, in politics, in media. They learned to shape narratives that bind you tighter than any chain. They gave you myths of freedom while selling you debt. They gave you myths of progress while stealing your time. They gave you myths of choice while designing your obedience. And like the stagecoach passengers, most men never question it. They sit quietly, rocking in rhythm, convinced the jolts are proof of progress. But now you see the machinery. You see how the illusion is built, how your mind is bent until you mistake cages for destiny. That awareness is not safe. It is a weapon. Because once you see the manipulation, the spell begins to break, and when it breaks, the system trembles. The Coffin on Wheels was only the beginning. The real prison was never made of wood and iron. It was made of stories, and stories once revealed can be burned to ash. Here is the truth no history book will tell you. Obedience became the most profitable industry in the world. Not gold, not oil, not land. Obedience. Because when you control a man's obedience, you control his labor, his time, his loyalty, his very soul, and he will hand it all over willingly. The stagecoach was an early blueprint. Passengers paid to be trapped. They endured agony because they believed it was the price of progress. Their silence became profit. Their suffering became revenue. Their obedience fed an entire empire of companies, drivers, owners, and investors. And when they emerged broken at the journey's end, they did not revolt. They thanked the system. They even paid again to ride once more. That is not transportation. That is monetized obedience. Now fast forward. Look at your world today. The formula has only evolved. Corporations don't just sell you products. They sell you cages. Subscriptions that drain you endlessly. Jobs that demand your time, your body, your loyalty, while whispering that you should be grateful for the opportunity. Governments that tax your silence, turning your compliance into the fuel of their machine. Entertainment that programs you to mistake chains for freedom. Every modern institution profits not merely from what you do, but from what you accept. Your obedience is their currency. Hollywood's role in this was not trivial. It was essential. By rewriting the agony of stagecoach travel into legend, they trained men to glamorize their own submission. They taught generations to see endurance of misery as masculine, to see quiet suffering as honorable. That message was more valuable to the system than gold, because a man who worships his chains will never try to break them. This is why truth is buried. Because if men realized their obedience was not destiny, but theft, not glory, but manipulation, they would revolt. If they understood that their silence feeds empires, they would speak. If they saw that their suffering is engineered, they would burn the system to the ground. That awareness would end the most profitable industry in history overnight. The passengers of the stagecoach were not just victims of a cruel journey. They were the first customers of a business model that has ruled every age since. Obedience for sale, packaged as progress, enforced by myth. And today, you are still being sold the same ride. The only question is whether you will keep buying the ticket. You may think the stagecoach is gone, a relic of a brutal past. But look closer. You are sitting in it now. The wheels are no longer made of wood. The driver no longer cracks a whip. But the ride is just as cruel. You are rocked back and forth, day after day, inside a coffin you were told to call normal life. And like the passengers of the Old West, you endure because you believe you have no choice. Think about your daily grind. You wake not because you are rested, but because a clock commands you. You spend hours inside fluorescent boxes, chained to desks, screens, schedules. Your back aches. Your spirit groans. Your energy is drained, not for your benefit, but for someone else's profit. And yet you endure it. Why? Because you've been told it is noble. Because they have sold you the myth of progress, the myth of stability, the myth of duty. You believe this misery is survival. But survival for whom? For you. Or for the system that feeds on your silence. Look at your debts. Look at the subscriptions you barely notice bleeding you dry. Look at the taxes that swallow your earnings before they even reach your hands. Every line item is a wheel, grinding you down mile after mile. And when you stagger home at night, exhausted, they place another illusion before your eyes. Glowing screens that sing you to sleep with stories, distracting you with myths so you never notice the coffin you ride in. This is not an accident. This is design. Just as the stagecoach passengers were trapped in their wooden cages, you are trapped in an engineered routine. You are told it is freedom, told it is opportunity, told it is the path every man must follow. And so, you obey. You suffer quietly. You pay for the privilege of being drained. That is the brilliance of modern control. You are not forced into obedience. You are convinced to choose it, but you are not like the others. You've already stepped on me. Ed off the stagecoach once in your mind. You've already spoken the words that most men will never dare whisper. You see the coffin for what it is, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every wheel turning is now a reminder. Every jolt is now a warning. Every mile is now a question. How much longer will you ride? Silence is not neutral. It is not passive. It is the most powerful weapon your oppressors ever forged. They don't need to chain your body if they can chain your tongue. They don't need to whip your back if they can convince you to whip your own mind. Every system of power in history has known this truth. Keep men silent, and they will endure anything. The stagecoach companies relied on it. The coffin on wheels was filled with groans, vomit, shattered nerves. But no one spoke. No one rebelled. Because silence breeds obedience. Each man believed his suffering was his alone, his burden to carry, his destiny. And so they sat quietly, rocking forward into misery, mile after mile, never realizing that the silence was the very cage that bound them, Hollywood reinforced that silence. By rewriting agony into legend, they turned screams into background noise. They taught generations of men that to be silent in suffering was noble, even masculine. Think about that carefully. They didn't just hide the truth. They weaponized it. They told you silence is strength. They told you voicing pain is weakness. And millions of men swallowed that poison until they forgot how to open their mouths. Look at today. How many men suffer silently in their jobs, in their debts, in their broken relationships, in their addictions? How many of them believe speaking up is shameful? That to admit suffering is failure? That to break the silence is to betray the myth of strength? This is not by accident. This is design. The silence is the system's masterpiece, the lock on every cage. And here is the darkest part. Silence does not just protect the system, it multiplies it. Because when one man remains silent, the man beside him believes he is alone. When no one speaks, each man thinks his suffering is unique, personal, deserved. And so the silence spreads, binding millions in invisible chains. The system doesn't need guards or whips anymore. The silence does all the work, but you, right now, you are breaking it. With every word you hear, every truth you allow into your mind, you are shattering the quiet that has bound generations. That is why this knowledge is dangerous. Not because it reveals the stagecoach, but because it reveals the silence. And once you break that, the coffin collapses. The question is, will you keep silent now that you know? Or will you make your voice a weapon? Silence is never born naturally. It is bred. It is cultivated like a crop. And the farmers of obedience have always known how to grow it. With shame, with isolation, with carefully designed rituals that teach men to suffocate themselves. This is the hidden art of control. Stagecoach passengers didn't just endure, they endured alone. Crammed shoulder to shoulder, yet cut off from one another by invisible walls. Each man was too proud, too ashamed, too conditioned to reveal his breaking point. If one was vomiting, another pretended not to notice. If one groaned in agony, the rest kept their eyes forward. The coffin on wheels became a theater of silence, a ritual where every man was taught the same lesson. Swallow your suffering, or be marked as weak. That is how the system bred silence. Not by force, but by shame. Hollywood amplified this lie. It glorified the stoic hero, the silent cowboy who suffered without complaint, who carried his agony in silence as proof of strength. But behind that myth was manipulation. Because once men believe silence is masculine, they will bury their truth so deeply they forget it even exists. They will smile through chains. They will laugh in the coffin. They will worship the cage that is killing them. Look around today, and you will see the ritual still alive. Men are isolated in endless competition, trained to see one another as rivals instead of allies. They are shamed into silence when they struggle, mocked when they reveal pain, ridiculed when they question the story. The result? They sit in their modern coffins, cubicles, apartments, cars in traffic, side by side, yet utterly alone. And in that loneliness, silence hardens into obedience. Understand this. Silence was never a side effect of suffering. It was engineered. It was cultivated deliberately, because rulers know that a man who suffers aloud can spark rebellion. But a man who suffers in silence can be controlled forever. That is the ritual. That is the curse passed from the stagecoach to the screen, from the screen to your daily life. But now, the ritual is broken. You hear the whispers they never wanted you to hear. You see that silence is not strength, it is surrender. And the moment you reject it, you step out of the coffin. You don't just free yourself, you light a fire in every man still trapped inside. So I'll ask you directly, how much longer will you carry their silence for them? Every system of control fears one thing above all: the man who refuses silence. Because when a man breaks silence, he does not just speak, he awakens. He steps outside the script. He declares himself no longer a passenger in their coffin, but a force shaping his own destiny. That is why silence is enforced with such intensity, because the instant it cracks, the entire illusion begins to unravel. The stagecoach was a cage of wood and iron, but the silence inside it was the true lock. Imagine if one passenger had stood up and shouted the truth. This is not noble. This is not progress. This is a coffin. Do you see what would have happened? The illusion would have shattered. The others would have felt their own chains. Rebellion might have sparked in that instant. And that is exactly why no one dared. Shame held them tighter than iron. But if even one had spoken, he would have become more than a passenger. He would have become a catalyst. That is the first step of initiation. To pierce the silence. To reject the script handed to you. To declare aloud that the suffering you were told to endure is not noble, not masculine, not destiny, but design. The moment you say it, the spell weakens. The moment you admit the truth, you step into forbidden ground. Because now you are no longer a victim of the ride. You are a man who sees it. And a man who sees cannot be controlled the same way again. This is why knowledge is dangerous. Not because it fills your mind, but because it transforms your identity. The instant you break silence, you become someone else. Someone they cannot easily categorize, shame, or herd. And that transformation terrifies the system. They built entire myths, entire industries, to stop you from reaching this point. That is why Hollywood glamorized silence. That is why schools punish questioning. That is why society ridicules truth-tellers. Because they know, once you break the silence, you cannot return. But understand this. Breaking silence is not comfortable. It is not safe. It is an initiation. And initiation is always dangerous. It isolates you from the herd. It forces you to confront what most men run from. But it also arms you with something rare and indestructible: awareness. The kind that cannot be bought, bribed, or erased. You are crossing a threshold now. This is where rebellion ends and transformation begins. You are no longer just a passenger hearing forbidden history. You are becoming something the system fears. A man who speaks. When you break silence, the world shifts. The coffin cracks, the myth crumbles, and for the first time, you see the faint outline of the hands pulling the strings. And this is the second trial of initiation. To look directly at the architects of illusion, the ones who designed the cages you mistook for freedom. The passengers of the stagecoach never saw them. They only saw the driver up front, the whip in his hand, the dust in their lungs. But the real power was elsewhere. Silent investors, faceless companies, men in boardrooms far from the agony of the road. They never smelled the stench of vomit inside the coffin. They never felt the splinters tearing into flesh. But they profited from every mile, every drop of obedience, every moment of silence. That is how power works. It hides behind layers, disguising itself as distant, untouchable, inevitable, and Hollywood's magicians perfected this deception. They took the filth, the suffering, the blood-soaked truth of the stagecoach and painted it with light, with music, with noble heroes. They rewrote torment as adventure, misery as masculinity, obedience as honor. Why? Because they understood their role. They were not entertainers. They were architects of perception, builders of myths, engineers of obedience. Their job was never to show you the truth. It was to make you love your chains. Do you see the pattern? Every system has its drivers, the visible faces you focus on, politicians, bosses, celebrities. But behind them are the architects, the quiet ones, the ones who profit from your silence without ever appearing in your line of sight. And the greatest deception is convincing you that they do not exist, that suffering is natural, that silence is masculine, that obedience is survival. Once you break silence, you cannot unsee them. You notice the fingerprints of the architects everywhere, in the debts that keep you chained, in the myths that keep you docile, in the illusions that train you to smile while you rot. And here lies the danger. To recognize the architects is to risk everything, because knowledge is not safe. It drags you deeper, forces you to confront the truth that your entire world was constructed, not discovered, designed, not destined. The second trial of initiation is this. Will you look into the eyes of the architects? Will you name them for what they are? Engineers of obedience, builders of coffins, profiteers of silence? Because once you do, the world will never look the same again. The architects are not satisfied with building cages of wood, steel, or story. They know those cages can be broken. No, what they truly desire is far more sinister, to build the cage inside your own mind, to make you carry it willingly, guard it fiercely, defend it as though it were your own creation. That is the perfection of control, not when they silence you, but when you silence yourself. Consider the stagecoach again. The real suffering was not the splinters, the sickness, or the exhaustion. It was the passengers convincing themselves that this was just how it is, that the pain was noble, that to endure without protest was honorable. The architects of that age had achieved something monstrous. They had weaponized psychology itself. They didn't need to enforce obedience. They had programmed it. Hollywood carried this programming forward, injecting it into the bloodstream of culture. The stoic hero, the silent cowboy, the noble sufferer. These weren't characters. They were instructions. They were psychological software, downloaded into generation after generation of men. The message was clear. Your suffering makes you strong. Your silence makes you manly. Your obedience makes you good. And every man who believed it carried the cage deeper into his own bones. But it goes even further. Think about how shame, guilt, and fear are planted in your psyche from the earliest years. Speak too loudly, and you are punished. Question authority, and you are ridiculed. Express pain, and you are mocked. By the time you are grown, the architects no longer need to discipline you. You are disciplining yourself. Every time you silence your own voice, every time you smother your own questions, every time you swallow your truth, the cage tightens, and you tighten it with your own hands. This is not weakness. It is programming, and it is everywhere. The architect's brilliance is that you no longer see the bars. You call them responsibility. You call them maturity. You call them manhood. And in doing so, you protect the very chains that were forged to break you. But now you know. The cage is not natural. It was engineered. The shame was planted. The guilt was cultivated. The silence was weaponized. And once you recognize that truth, the programming begins to crack. That is why this knowledge is dangerous. It is not just history. It is a mirror. And once you look into it, the reflection staring back at you will never be the same man again. The deepest trick of the architects is not building the cage, nor even convincing you to carry it. It is turning you into the warden of your own prison. Because once a man polices himself, once he punishes himself for even thinking about escape, the system no longer needs to lift a finger. He has become both prisoner and guard, victim and executioner. Look again at the Stagecoach. Those men, rocking endlessly in the coffin of misery, were not just silent because they feared judgment from others. They were silent because they judged themselves. The voice in their own heads told them, "Don't complain, don't reveal weakness, don't disrupt the ride." They had absorbed the system so completely that they no longer needed chains, no longer needed whips, no longer needed guards. They had become their own oppressors. And that is the most terrifying prison of all, the one that lives inside you. Hollywood taught you to love that prison. The cowboy who keeps it all inside, the soldier who never cracks, the man who dies with his teeth clenched and his heart sealed. These were not just stories, they were blueprints. They trained you to discipline yourself, to shame yourself, to punish yourself for even desiring freedom. They taught you to mistake the cage for honor and the silence for power. And you see it everywhere today. Men dragging themselves through lives they secretly hate, but telling themselves it's noble to endure. Men strangling their own truth to avoid appearing weak. Men punishing themselves with alcohol, with overwork, with quiet despair, believing all along that this is what strength looks like. The architects don't need to chain you when you chain yourself. They don't need to whip you when you lash your own back. This is the final weapon, inversion. Making you believe the prison is freedom. Making you believe the silence is strength. Making you believe obedience is masculinity. Once you believe that, you are no longer just a prisoner. You are the jailer. You keep yourself in line. You mock those who try to escape. You enforce the very rules that are killing you. But the moment you see this, the spell weakens. Because the architects cannot survive exposure. Their system collapses the instant you refuse to be both prisoner and guard. And here is the truth. The key to the cage has always been in your hand. You were just trained never to look at it. The question now is not whether you are trapped. It is whether you are ready to stop being your own warden. You have traveled far enough now to see it clearly. The Stagecoach was never just a coffin of wood and iron. It was a symbol, a prototype of every system designed to carry men into obedience while convincing them they were free. The architects hid behind the driver, behind the Hollywood lens, behind every mask they could create. But the truth has never changed. They do not need to chain your body when they can colonize your mind. They do not need to silence you when they can make you silence yourself. They do not need to enslave you when they can make you believe the chains are strength. This is the forbidden knowledge. The Stagecoach never ended. It simply evolved. Today, the wheels are different. The cages are more polished. The myths are more sophisticated. But the ride is the same. You are crammed into systems that rot your body, numb your mind, and strip your will, all while being told it is progress, all while being told it is noble. And just like the passengers in that coffin of dust and sickness, you are taught to endure in silence, to mistake obedience for strength, to carry your suffering as though it were honor. But the truth is sharper, darker, more dangerous. Endurance is not strength. Silence is not manhood. Obedience is not honor. These are lies woven into you by architects who profit from your misery. The real strength is in seeing the cage. The real power is in breaking silence. The real honor is in refusing to be your own jailer. And so, I will leave you with this final revelation. Once you have seen the stagecoach for what it truly was, you cannot unsee the world around you. The cubicles, the debts, the endless distractions, the myths of stoicism and noble suffering, they are the same coffin, repainted, refitted, repackaged. But now you know, and knowing makes you dangerous, because the architects cannot control the man who recognizes the cage, who rejects the silence, who stops policing himself and begins to speak, to act, to awaken. You were never meant to hear this. They built entire industries to make sure you never did. But now it is too late. You heard the whisper. You felt the coffin shake, and somewhere inside, a door has opened. You can close it, pretend you never heard, climb back into the silence. Or you can step through it, into the darkness, into the unknown, into the dangerous freedom they fear most. The choice is yours. But remember this, the ride only continues if you stay in your seat.